All right, so today we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about how our adrenal glands are related to fatigue, insomnia, and weight gain, and how we can solve it by helping our adrenals get healthier. So today we'll talk about what our adrenals are, what they do, what adrenal fatigue is, and how we can diagnose it and identify it in ourselves, and how we can treat it holistically so we can feel better and have the energy that we want again. So let's talk about the adrenal glands. Our adrenal glands are these little pyramid-shaped structures that sit on top of our kidneys, and they have two parts. They have the outside part, which is called the cortex, and they have the inside part, that red part in the picture, that's called the medulla. Now, our adrenals make a ton of different types of hormones for us, but the two we're going to focus on today are adrenaline and cortisol. Now, the middle of the adrenals, that medulla, makes what we call adrenaline, or the scientific way to say that is epinephrine. Now, that's our primary stress hormone, and we'll talk about how that works. And then cortisol is made in the outside, that cortex of the adrenal, and that is our sort of supporting role. That's what helps our adrenaline do what it's supposed to do. So how does this stress response actually work? So stress for us is the response of our ancestors, in the sense that we've been programmed over thousands and probably millions of years that stress is something that happens when we are in danger. So our body physically has to be ready to escape. And so what happens is our heart beats fast to give us lots of blood to our brain so we can think fast, and to our muscles so we can run fast. And that's the primary thing that our adrenaline, our epinephrine, does for us, is it helps that heart beat fast, and then we can think and we can run. Now, cortisol supplies the energy to our heart and to our brain and to our muscles so we can escape. And we'll talk about how that works next. So cortisol works by increasing the blood sugar. Now, the way that it does it is it takes anything that's in storage, it takes our energy that's in storage and it converts it into glucose. And so you can, feed the brain, feed the heart, feed the muscles. And it primarily does this during stress, when we make our stress hormones, that adrenaline. Now, there's a second time our cortisol is produced, and that's when our blood sugar gets super low. And so, we have to have our brains and our muscles be able to function. And so when our blood sugar gets really low, say 7 or 8 hours after we've eaten, that's another time we make cortisol to spike. Now, that becomes important at night if we have been asleep. Say we eat dinner at 6 o'clock, by 3 in the morning, it's been 9 hours. So often, especially if we already have blood sugar that's a little unstable, or we already have a lot of stress, we'll make that cortisol, and then 3 a.m. we're wide awake. Now, cortisol is supposed to be produced in what we call a circadian rhythm, where it's really nice and high first thing in the morning, and then it's lowest at night when we're supposed to be asleep. And that's because, just like we just talked about, cortisol is very stimulating. It makes our brains feel wide awake, which is great first thing when we're getting to our work, but not as great at 3 a.m. Now, the thing I like to tell people, the number one thing is the most important thing you can do to feel awesome through menopause and beyond is manage your stress. And we're going to talk a little bit about why right now. So, adrenal fatigue. What is adrenal fatigue? It's just what it sounds like. It's when we have so much stress over such an extended period of time that our adrenals start not working as efficiently as we would like them to. So stage 0 of adrenal fatigue is there's stress, and then we just take care of it. Our body knows what to do, and then it calms down afterwards. Now, when we have a lot of stress over an extended period of time, say, 6 to 12 months, we have a ton of stress. We start to make our stress hormones all the time in a way that's not healthy for us. And that's when people start feeling a lot of anxiety. You may start feeling tired. You may not be able to sleep well. When stressors happen, say, something drops on the floor, or someone, sort of bursts into the room. We overreact. I have a lot of people tell me, there's something happens and I just overreact to it. And that during these acute, very large stressors, when we start to feel that overreaction to stress, we may also start losing some weight. So that's something we'll see often during times of, say, a very intense relationship breakup, or the death of a loved one, or a really intense job that makes us very stressed. We might start losing some weight. But what we see is over time, when we move into that stage 2, and we've been making those hormones, those stress hormones, over and over and over for a really extended period of time, for years, then that's when these stress patterns like the anxiety and the insomnia become very much more entrenched. They're harder to reverse. And then because we're spiking our blood sugar all the time, our cells start to not accept sugar. And that's when we move into insulin resistance or other blood sugar imbalances, or even type 2 diabetes. Because the blood sugar is high, another thing that happens is because our stress is different now, and we're not actually having to run and think so fast. And so we don't use all that sugar that gets mobilized. So it circles back and our body turns it into triglycerides. And that's what we store as fat. So a lot of times if we start gaining weight kind of around the middle and we've had this extended stress, then we're sort of moving into that stage 2 of adrenal fatigue. And when we gain fat, we tend to lose muscle as well. And so that's when we start getting that sort of like apple physique that no one's that excited about. Now, over a very extended period of time with a lot of stress, our adrenals, they have been, say, in stage 1 and stage 2, they've been making these stress hormones way too much. We have higher levels of cortisol. And then once we get to stage 3, that's when our adrenals just poop out and we stop making our hormones efficiently. And that's when we start to feel really profoundly fatigued. So we may be exhausted, we may feel even weak, while exercise 3 years ago made me feel really good and I was really jazzed afterwards. Now exercise is just exhausting. And you may even start to feel some dizziness or some intolerance to our environment. So we can start having inappropriate sort of immune reactions to things. So how do we know if we have adrenal fatigue? I mean, obviously the first thing is, looking at our symptoms and seeing if we feel in a way that seems to be consistent with one of those stages of adrenal fatigue. But then if we really want some data, I like to look at our cortisol levels. And I generally start with saliva cortisol levels because they tell us about free cortisol that's available for us to use. And I optimally like to look at what I call a diurnal cortisol. And that is when we look at cortisol 4 times during the day. And that way we can make sure that circadian rhythm where things are high in the morning and low at night is being followed. If we're really concerned about adrenal burnout, we can do something where that's called ACTH stimulation testing. ACTH is the hormone that your brain makes that tells your adrenals to make those stress hormones. And so if we give the body some of that, we can see if our adrenals are able to react to those brain signals any longer. Now, one thing I do like to mention is that a lot of times when our adrenals are getting fatigued, a lot of our hormones are changing at the same time, especially if, for women, once they're getting into their 40s and 50s and hormones are changing anyway. A lot of times we will see that the adrenal hormones will get out of balance at the same time as our other types of hormones, our reproductive hormones, for instance, like estrogen and progesterone, or even our thyroid. So I'd like to look at the whole, what I call symphony, because they all have to work together to keep your body in optimal balance. So once we know that there's some adrenal fatigue, how do we make it better? Well, the first thing, the most obvious piece that I really like to stress for folks is if we've had a lot of stress over time, how do we cut that off? How do we make that more manageable and easier on the body in general? And there's a few things. One is that we just develop some awareness around what causes us stress and how we manage our stress. but then also is just doing some of these other sort of activities and rituals that can help us to feel better over time. One is to exercise, because exercise does actually help to bring down and really regulate the stress response. Sleeping and resting is absolutely critical. We have to be in bed for the right amount of time. We have to be in bed for enough time. And we have to take naps if we need naps. We have to take breaks from work during the day. You can't just work 8 hours straight on through. We have to make sure that we're resting and allowing our body to go into that rest and repair cycle. And then the other piece is letting things go, letting other people in your life take over stuff that you don't need to do. So delegating can be a really big piece, especially for those of us who really like to make sure that everything is done right. So how do we eat to support our adrenal glands? So our cortisol is made from cholesterol, and cholesterol gets a bad rap, but we do need it to make all of our reproductive hormones and our cortisol. And so that means either eating cholesterol from animal products like meats or dairy or egg, or your body has to make it from carbohydrate. So if you don't eat any animal products, then you just know that you're going to need those extra calories so your body can synthesize it from scratch. Although realistically, your body does a little bit better when you just eat a little bit of cholesterol to get the cortisol synthesized. Now, our epinephrine or our adrenaline is made from amino acids, and those amino acids are just the component parts of proteins. So I generally like to recommend 2 to 3 servings a day of protein. Obviously, the animal-based proteins are great, but then there's also things like nuts and seeds, putting legumes and grains together in your meals, and then things like quinoa, which is our only grain that's a complete protein. If we need to supplement specific amino acids so you can make your epinephrine and your other types of amino acid-based hormones, we can do that, but generally dietarily is going to get it for you. If we have a lot of prolonged stress over time, we already talked about the impact that can have on our blood sugar. So it's really important when we're trying to balance our adrenal health that we minimize our sugars and our refined starch, especially if we already have that tendency towards spiking the blood sugar anyway. Any extra sugars are going to really just exacerbate that whole problem. So if we're going to have some carbohydrate, have complex carbohydrates like grains or winter squash or sweet potatoes that are also very rich in minerals and other sort of phytonutrients that are going to help us to synthesize our hormones appropriately. Electrolytes are really important because our mineral balance is actually regulated by our adrenals. So things like potassium, which we can find in coconut water and avocados and potatoes, or magnesium, which we get from greens and nuts and seeds. Those are really critical because we have to have enough of those that our adrenals can balance them appropriately. Now, one of the more specific things I like to talk about with the diet for adrenal health is if you are in that category of folks who tend to wake at 3 a.m. And not go back to sleep, if it has to do with that adrenal piece that our cortisol is kicking in, one of the ways to really manage that is by having a little bit of protein before bed. And the reason for that is it keeps our blood sugar more well-regulated, more stable throughout the night. So I don't want you having to eat a steak before bed. I don't want something that's going to sit in your gut, but something that's easy to digest, but keeps the blood sugar stable, like an apple and peanut butter, some Greek yogurt with berries, a hard-boiled egg, a handful of nuts, whatever works for you. Now, getting even a little more specific with some of our natural allies that can help our adrenals get better, we like to call anything that makes the adrenals a little bit healthier is something we would call an adaptogen. An adaptogen is a tonic to the adrenal glands that helps to make it healthier over time. And we have 3 basic categories of adaptogens that are all really helpful for different scenarios. The first is our stimulating adaptogens. That's when we have a lot of fatigue and we really don't feel like we can get through the day. These are really good daytime appropriate adrenal supports that tend to be a little bit more stimulating that we can use to help us feel more energetic during the day. So these stimulating adaptogens are things like ginseng and rhodiola. Our relaxing adaptogens kind of do the opposite, and they help our adrenals to get better by allowing them to rest at the right time. So if our adrenals tend to be sort of like pumping at night when we should be sleeping at night, the relaxing adaptogens are really helpful in that time. Ashwagandha is one of my very favorites for that. Phosphatidylserine is also a nutrient that's very good for that as well. Our balanced adaptogens are something a little bit in the middle, but I love our balanced adaptogens because they help to restore our deeper energy over the longer term. So, over weeks to months to years. And things like Siberian ginseng and Devil's Club are really nice. They help us to feel more energetic, but it's not quite as stimulating as some of our other options. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you've learned a little something. If you'd like to learn more, please feel free to contact me. You can reach me through my website, goldenholisticmedicine.com. And if you'd like to learn more through my courses, feel free to take a look at my Women's Hormone Health Masterclass and my Foundations of Health course, which also helps you as an individual to really build your own health system. All right. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon.